Great, thanks. And thanks to Uehiro Centre and St. Cross for hosting this seminar. Okay, there's a bunch of sources in which you'll find all the answers to those hard questions that you might ask me at the end of this. So a bit of background. Collection of genomic and biometric data in population-wide or bulk databases, notably DNA, facial images, is rapidly expanding. And one concern is the integration of all that data to develop detailed pictures of individuals and their lives and so on. And I guess the paradigm there is China and their social credit system. Good to hear there's some geneticists here. Since I don't know a lot about geneticists, and I was hoping to have some discussion to iron out any problems. However, my understanding is that techniques for extracting information from DNA are constantly evolving, and massively parallel sequencing of DNA enables not only identification of an individual as an offender, and this talk is about essentially about criminal investigations and the relationship of some of these DNA techniques with criminal investigations. And importantly, therefore, not simply about identifying an individual, but also getting detailed information about their characteristics. A third relevant development is the holding by private companies of very large amounts of DNA data, Ancestry.com and so on, estimated at 30 million or so DNA profiles worldwide. And the relevance of that to this talk is that accessing those DNA profiles is something that criminal investigators are doing. And that's a large part of the set of issues that are of interest to me in this paper. So some of the ethical principles that need to be looked at in relation to this are as follows, and one can have fairly detailed discussions, I think, about most of these. I'm not going to be talking in detail about all of them, but I'll give you some sort of sense of some of these principles. There's issues of informed consent, moral rights to one's DNA profile, moral right not to self-incriminate in relation to law enforcement getting your DNA to prove that you were the guy at the crime scene or whatever. Another kind of principle that's in play is reasonable suspicion. So this arises in the context of getting the DNA of the relatives of a suspect, where the name of the suspect is not known, the relatives of the person who left the blood sample or whatever at the crime scene, and investigating those individuals. And then the question arises as to whether or not the mere fact that you're a relative of someone who was at this crime scene is a sufficient condition for you being investigated under in the context of it being a necessary condition for investigating someone that you have reasonable suspicion that they've committed an offence. So there's that kind of issue. But against that, we've got the fact that a lot of these techniques are such that they enable criminal investigators to identify, arrest and charge very serious criminals, murderers, serial murderers in the case of a number of famous cases, rapists, etc. So there's a huge upside to the use of these techniques in law enforcement. Other kinds of ethical considerations I want to be looking at is, can be argued. I'd be interested to see what the geneticists and those who are knowledgeable in this area think about this, that in the case of members of families that one can trace based on the DNA sample at some crime scene, do they have joint rights to that DNA data, given that it's overlapping DNA data? Another kind of concept that is involved in this is collective moral responsibility to assist law enforcement in their investigations. So what I'm going to try and do is crank through some of these issues and then suggest some ethical guidelines that might give direction to regulators, because this whole area is certainly, if nothing else, we can say it's under-regulated. Okay, so forensic genealogy of the sort that is of interest here. Forensic genealogy is a potential node creation of what the co-author of mine, Marcus Smith, refers to as quasi-universal forensic DNA databases. So you've got a database which is a database of all the persons, the DNA of all the persons who have been convicted of crimes, plus some others. And in each case, you can say justify the collection and retention of that person's DNA. But generally it's held, you can't go around just collecting everyone's DNA and sticking them and then having a sort of universal DNA bank of the individual's DNA is such that they're entitled not to have that collected and retained by the state. Forensic genealogy, on the other hand, given you can access, law enforcement people are accessing stuff in some of these held by some of these private companies, arguably is leading to a situation where you've got a kind of, in effect, universal database, because you've got, say, 6 million DNA profiles of offenders and so on, but another X 30 million worldwide, but a significant percentage of other DNA profiles accessible to, say, the police in the UK, and put those two things together, and you can generate the DNA of a very large, if not all, percentage of the UK population. So it is argued. I'm not arguing that here today, but that's you can see where the argument goes, because you've got a whole bunch of DNA, you've got access to a whole lot of other DNA, and then you can figure out other sorts of DNA on the basis of the DNA you've got, and so on and so forth, using ordinary investigative techniques, and you can generate a very significant, in effect, a very significant database of DNA, referred to as Smith as a quasi-universal DNA database. Okay, so how does this sort of work? I've just worked through an example. If criminal investigators do not obtain a match in a national database for a suspect's DNA profile taken from a crime scene, so someone's been murdered, there's a blood sample at the crime scene, they get the DNA from the crime scene, they match it in the national database, and they can't come up with a match. Okay. So what they can do then is they can search a commercial genomic database, say 23andMe, Ancestry.com, whatever, and see if they can find a match there, or see if they can find someone in that database whose DNA is related, familiar, that in terms of a family or relative, to whoever the person's is whose DNA is at the crime scene. So there's a common ancestry between the DNA of the person who's at the crime scene and this person who's given their DNA profile to this commercial database. And that way, they can build up. So they've got Fred, they've got an unknown person's DNA at the crime scene. Let's call it the suspect. The suspect has got some relative, and it could be a second, third, fourth cousin or something in a commercial database. And then they can go and look at, so they know there's some sort of genetic connection there, but they then go and do a whole lot of standard policing homework. They look up marriages, deaths, etc., to build the family tree of the individual who in the ancestry.com database. And that ultimately constitutes a very significant number of suspects, potentially, because it may well be the case that one of those people or one of the people they're connected to is a suspect, that is the one who's left their blood sample at the crime scene. So, but in order to determine who this individual is, they're going to have to check the DNA, identify check the DNA of each of these people in their family tree and see if it matches the DNA at the sample. So they've got a whole bunch of people they know that are connected to the DNA at the crime scene. They've achieved this by getting at least one DNA sample from the private provider, and then they've gone away and built up this family tree on that basis. Okay, so then what they need to do now, having this family tree, or even a number of family trees actually, they then need to look at each of these people and do some investigation and see whether or not they were in the area at the time, or if they're, right sort of age, or would they have a motive, and so on and so forth. And they narrow it down in that way to a bunch of people who could reasonably be their suspect. That is the person who was at the crime scene, who's likely committed the crime. Now, at that point, what they need to do is actually get the DNA off those people to see if it actually matches the DNA at the crime scene. They need a match. Okay. Now, what they could do is they could ask them, "Can you give me a sample of DNA?" But of course, they may not be willing to provide that, and typically they wouldn't be legally required to do so, depending on the circumstances. So, coming back to what's on the screen there, what can happen at that point is that the investigators undertake, in effect, a covert obtaining of a DNA sample rather than getting their consent. So they hang around and wait for them to leave a sample of saliva on a cup or whatever. Okay, so that's roughly the use of forensic genealogy technique by these criminal investigators, and it's been spectacularly successful in a number of cases. And the famous case is the Californian serial killer, Golden State Killer, who was hanging around for, got him up for 30 years. And the thing there is, it's not simply bringing someone who's already committed crimes to justice, someone who's already committed crimes, bringing them to justice. It's also about preventing, the deaths, saving the lives of the people that they're still, that individual is still targeting. Okay, so that's the sort of area, or the specific kind of issue that I think is interesting and raises a range of ethical issues. So what are some of the sort of ethical principles or ethical sort of values, if you like, that are in play here? Well, forensic, it saves lives and serves justice. That's pretty important. Keeps the society safe and so on. There's an issue about informed consent, and not simply consent, but is it fully informed in terms of if you hand over your DNA, do you actually realise the extent to which that is able to be used as intellectual property by, say, one of these firms, but in particular, do you actually have a really good understanding of what's actually going on here? When you consent, say, to the law enforcement people, and that's partly to do with issues about whether or not your DNA would be destroyed when the investigation is completed, assuming you're exculpated, found not to be involved and so on. But that's an issue. There's a kind of general issue here about whether or not your DNA or at least the information, the genetic information derivable from the physical stuff is something to which you have ownership rights in a matter of private property, or is it much more like your arms and your legs? It's something which is constitutive of you, and you can't or shouldn't think of it as something which has private property rights. There's an issue here about, so if you give your, in a lot of jurisdictions, if someone can take your, I mean, when the police took your saliva or whatever was off the coffee cup, they're sort of not, their primary interest is in the genetic information extractable from they don't want to own the piece of fluid, right? So the cells, and so the question is whether or not, even if they're entitled to grab a piece of you, as it were, a hair from you, so you think, well, of course, I mean, it's just a hair I left lying around, or it's I gave this lock of my hair to a pop star, to someone, and someone, it's a gift. I own it when it's on me, but if it falls off me, I don't own it. So, well, hang on. I mean, what about the information that's extractable from that physical item that you, as it were, jettisoned? Or is that something to which you retain a right? Even though, of course, the physical entity itself, perhaps you don't. Issues, there's a bunch of other issues to do with, is this genetic information constitutive in some, it seems to be constitutive of biological identity, pretty clearly. Is your biological identity an aspect of your overall identity? And is your overall identity species identities? It's also perhaps identity qua member of a family group or whatever. And then, of course, it's also presumably constitutive of you as an individual, able to be identified as different from every other individual on the planet, other than perhaps your twin brother or sister or whatever, if you've got one. Another kind of principle that's in play is the right not to self-incriminate by handing over your DNA sample. And what sort of rights are, moral rights I'm talking about at the moment rather than legal rights, what sort of moral rights are in play here? Is it simply a matter of individual rights, so your individual rights to control, let's say, the genetic information derivable from your DNA, or is it how we to make, what if we're talking about, as it were, the human genome, which is essentially the that whatever genetic information is such that it makes you a member of the human species. Is that something that some people have argued is a matter of, is like the commons or something? We all own it as we own, as we might be said to own, you know, the atmosphere or something. And more specifically, an issue that interests me is whether or not the concept of an individual moral right is sufficient in relation to, let's call it the family genome. That is, where you've got a certain number of people which are distinguishable from all other human beings, but have the common genetic ancestry such that the genetic information is overlapping. And if that's the case, should we be talking about not simply an individual right to that information, but a joint right? That is, the members of that family, those people are related to one another. Is there genetic information that they jointly own, as opposed to simply one person owning it, or each person owning it independently of the others owning it? So putting this in, we're wrapping this up to some extent. So the first point is that it would seem to fly in the face of the concept of intellectual property rights to genes and DNA, that is to gene patenting, if it's the case that genetic information is a constituent element of our identity, because it would be, to patent that would be equivalent, or arguably equivalent, or certainly analogous to patenting your arm or your leg, or your body, which would start to look like some kind of modern version of slavery or something. So whatever rights people, I'm talking about moral rights, have to genetic information, looks like it is not, at least in the first instance, intellectual property rights, understood as common or garden intellectual property rights that are simply a species of rights to property. Second point is the sort of logical structure of the right in question, simply an individual right that I have by virtue of properties that I have as an individual, end of story. That may be true of some genetic information, or some large fragment of the genetic information that makes me who I am. But is there also a need for a concept of joint rights with respect to genetic information that I share with family members, such that, for example, I shouldn't disclose that information to someone, because in so doing I would be disclosing the information of my brother or sister. So I would need their consent if it's a joint right. Okay, so I'm going to get that on the table. Okay, so let's see if this concept of a joint right has got something going for it. If there's, that's a somewhat abstract notion. Let's think of there's the human, the generic human genome. There's as it were, the individual human being's genome, the Seumas Miller genome, which is such that can distinguish myself genetically from all you. And then, but is there also as it were, a family genome, which marks off the members of this family from all those other members of the human race, as well as, and of course, the human genome marks off the species from other species. And if that's the case, do we need to, the family, if there is this family genome, however abstract a notion is it something that, since genetic information is constitutive of me, I have a right to it? Oh, hang on, we must have a joint right to it, because after all, it's something to which myself and my brother and sister and so on is a constitutive of each of us, but not constitutive of other human beings. And so perhaps if there's a joint right in that sense, then there may be a need for consent to relatives before we start giving samples away for genetic analysis and so on, and more particularly before we start handing out genetic information to law enforcement in the context of the sort of investigation that I laid out here before. Because what happens is, remember, we got the big family tree. The law enforcement people coming around saying, okay, look, I'd really like to, we don't really believe you committed the crime, but look, it would make things a lot easier if you just give us a sample of your DNA, and then we can match it, and we can say, we can tick you can go, you know. But, oh, great, you know, oh, hang on, if I do that, can I do that? Because my DNA is, it's a joint right. I better ask my brother, because then I'll have information and so on. Okay, so if that's the way to think about this, then the flip side of this from the law enforcement perspective would be, so if you've got a bunch of people who've got joint rights to genomic data, and we've all got to agree, let's say, to give this, if there's some murderer running around the place killing people, presumably you've got a moral responsibility to assist them. So if we just think of this in terms of an individual, if law enforcement comes knocking on your door and says, look, we're trying to find out, we're trying to track down the serial killer, you know, blah, blah, can you help? Oh yeah, sure, I've got an obligation to help. What are you going to do? What do you need from? I need a sample of your DNA. We'll just check it, and then we'll destroy it after the investigation. So you're not going to retain it. We're not going to sell it to some commercial company. You know, so, oh, fine, no problem. You have a responsibility. You know, you have a right to your DNA, but on the other hand, that is not to hand it out so that people can know that have that genetic information. But you've also got obligation, perhaps in that case, it seems. But now it's a joint right. You're going to have to ask your brother or something. Okay, so that's all very well. So then the question is, but what happens if someone doesn't want to go along with this? For example, or a number of people don't want to go along with it. Another issue is, how strong is this right? So I've got a right to my DNA data, but can that right be? And we have that right as a bunch of family members. But how stringent is that right? I mean, does that override? I mean, so if law enforcement comes around and says, I want your DNA, why? Well, you think you might have stolen a paddle pop. You say, well, no, I don't think so, you know. But on the other hand, if it's a matter of tracking down a serial killer, then maybe under warrant and so on, you should be forced to give your DNA sample, assuming it's going to be destroyed and so on and so forth. And if most rights, including individual moral rights, can be overridden, presumably joint rights can be overridden, which is essentially what that slide says. Okay, so in this final section, I'm just going to dump a bunch of ethical principles that in light of all that, ethical principles that I think ought to inform regulation. And so there's about 7 of them. Okay, so the first thing is that remember the distinction between universal databases and quasi-universal databases. It seems to me that universal databases of DNA and therefore quasi-universal databases shouldn't be permitted. I don't think that we should allow law enforcement to just say, okay, we want all the DNA of everyone in a data bank, so law enforcement can just use. I don't think that's acceptable. And if that's not acceptable, I think a sort of indirect way of coming to the same endpoint, namely via use of forensic genealogy, et cetera, I don't think that's going to be acceptable either. So I don't think quasi-universal databases should be permitted. Secondly, if a person is reasonably suspected of committing a crime or is among a group of familiar relatives, one of whom is suspected of a serious crime, problem is they have an individual or joint right to control the genetic information, and they've got an individual or joint responsibility in the familial case to provide the DNA to investigate it. So they have a right to the DNA, but they also have an obligation to provide it. So how are we going to adjudicate that? Well, I think the idea is that really how serious is the range of offences in question? We're talking murders, rapes. Okay, if it's very serious, it meets a proportionality requirement. Well, I think, sorry, that your right's overridden by the importance of nailing murderers, rapists, etc. So, but not pickpockets or jaywalkers or whatever. The second thing is, well, is it actually necessary, right? Is there some, I mean, do we actually need to go through this process? Is there some other way of doing this which doesn't require you to, or the group to hand over their DNA? So it needs to pass a necessity and proportionality test. And then third principle is, I think, having said all that, if you're an offender, I think you have a right to, there is a legal right not to self-incriminate, and I think that's based on a kind of basic moral principle that you, in the end of the day, you've got a right to defend yourself against the state, even if you are guilty of the offence, right? So I think that's the basis. So that's my third principle. Fourthly, law enforcement should have a legal right to access DNA databases collected for other purposes. So, for example, these Ancestry.com and what have you, except in two sorts of case. There's a particular already uniquely identified person who is reasonably suspected of having committed a serious crime, and access to the DNA is granted under warrant. Okay. There's a particular already uniquely identified person who is not suspected of having committed a serious crime, but is a member of a group of familiar relatives, one of whom are reasonably suspected by law enforcement of having committed a serious crime, and access to the non-suspect DNA that is granted under warrant. So basically, that just firms up the necessity of proportionality by specifying the two different cases and adding the under warrant requirement. Fifthly, persons intending to provide the DNA for another purpose, either a health provider or to a commercial provider, have a moral right and should have a legal right to be informed that their DNA might be accessed by law enforcement. In other words, we don't want a situation where the police are running around doing this in a sort of ad hoc way and people don't know what's going on. They need to know that could be a use to which their DNA is put when they decide to look up where your uncle came from, whatever. Sixth, insofar as the use of genomic data created for health and ancestry can be justified for the investigation of serious crimes, and privacy, autonomy, individual and joint rights, and other concerns are mitigated. So insofar as we're going to allow criminal investigators to access DNA under those conditions, we need to make sure that there are accountability mechanisms in place to make sure that that's actually in fact what they're doing and doing it in accordance with those principles and so on. And then the final thing is the proposed legislation in this area needs to be, you know, public debated, needs to be aired. We need to kind of get different perspectives of where people are coming from and so on. And if the legislation is based on this, we need to look at have judicial review to make sure that it's working appropriately and so on. So that's just a bunch of standard protections. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Questions? Tom.
Thanks, great talk, thank you. So I wanted to flag one thing, which is that there's lots of interest in newborn genome screening as a replacement for what's already done, which is samples of blood spots for newborn screening. And so that potentially in the not very distant future will generate very large databases of population-wide DNA, and it certainly is already the case that police can access health databases where the criteria are there. So
Yeah.
So I wanted to flag that, and I think there's an interesting question about how we respond to that and whether we need actually to partition that off so that it doesn't become a universal database that's accessible to the police, or really tighten up the rules that police have. And then I had another point about fingerprints, but I can.
Yeah, so so I was focusing on ancestry, but I think the general same, a lot of the same principles are going to be in play in relation to some of those health databases. But I guess one difference is, I mean, ancestry, you've got private providers who are getting a lot of data, some of this DNA data to make money. I think it's a bit different. And the creation of these sort of databases for some other important collective good raises a bunch of other questions, which I haven't really gone into. But so you might say, although there's still a lot of issues about law enforcement access and how that would be handled and so on. So you might say, look, on the one hand, so someone might say, look, as far as the human genome is concerned, we should have it. It shouldn't be a matter of intellectual property, but we do need that data because it's going to be extraordinarily useful for the common good and so on and so forth. And then you might say, in addition, when it comes to various genomic information that pertains to a bunch of genetic diseases, for example, that we need that as well. And those things you might say are so important that we need to have them, and then we need to build walls around them, or develop principles on the assumption that we've got them because we need them to limit law enforcement access under certain conditions, or strengthen it, or do it under warrant for various sorts of investigations. But you might say about a lot of the other commercial stuff, well, you know, it's just a commercial enterprise. It's not clear that you know, that this is something we have to have. Therefore, you might build rules around it that are much tougher and that might undermine it as a commercial enterprise.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So as a biologist and geneticist, that was quite interesting. And I mean, just a couple of things. So in terms of sequencing, certainly there's a lot of data and genetic data being generated. I mean, UK Biobank has hundreds of thousands of UK individuals there now. And as you said, I mean, I'm on 23andMe actually. And I certainly think that, you know, the future in terms of sequencing and genetic data generation is just to increase it, as you mentioned, in terms of newborns.
Yeah.
I think the future will be people, you know, you have a baby and you get a DVD with the baby when you go home with the genome. So that is the future. I had one question because I didn't know whether someone who's on 23andMe, which is, can the police actually accesses the data there?
I think so. What happened initially? Yes, and now they've. I think those companies are now. There's two advising that they can either that they can and they have to. So when you give your data, they say, hang on, you need to realise that the police can access this. And in the other case, I think they can only they're just starting to develop rules. They can only do it under warrant and so on and so forth. But I think it varies from one jurisdiction to another. But it's yeah.
Okay, I know you with UK Biobank, people who are there, they can withdraw at any moment.
Yeah, sure.
So, but I don't know about 23andMe. I assume the same thing, but they never told me. I've done it some years.
Yeah.
They never told me, hey, you know, this could go to the MI5.
Yeah, so was this the case where they want to access your data and then you're alerted to this? You get in there and pull it out before it's been accessed. Is that what you got in mind?
Yes.
I don't know about that. Yeah, right.
Well, I mean,
That's true. Well, it's true. You can. Yeah, well, I guess it's a timing issue, but good. I don't know what happens there.
There is one thing interesting on 23andMe if you haven't done it, which is you can go there and can search for relatives.
Maybe if it's under warrant, you probably can't actually. Yeah. So if there's a warrant, that would take precedence. So you would, even though you've got a prior right to remove it or have it destroyed or whatever, if it was under warrant, you wouldn't be able to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if anyone online has a question, please raise a virtual hand. Guys. Okay.
Thank you. Great talk. Thank you. I'm a microbiologist, and so would like to make another kind of comment similar to what colleagues have made about expansion. Our lab, where I'm based in Sydney, in Australia, sequence a lot of pathogens from individuals, from clinical samples for public health purposes, for clinical diagnosis. We also provide this information from time to time to lawyers. Admittedly, I'm not talking about criminal lawyers,
Right.
I'm talking about personal injury lawyers.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it's not about, it's more about compensation. There's cases about the source of infection, transmission of infection, who gave infection to whom, whether we're talking about HIV, for example,
Yeah.
we're talking about salmonella, and it raises multiple questions that you've started discussing about ownership. It's still not fully resolved whether I own salmonella genome, which was cultured from my clinical sample. My position would be that no, it's nothing. It's the salmonella does not define my identity.
Yeah. Hopefully not.
Or Neisseria gonorrhea, etc. But more importantly, there are multiple databases that lawyers access, or whether this is defendant or whatever part of the judicial process is involved. And I've been asked to provide expert opinion to the Crown, and even subpoena, we received subpoena from courts to upload sequencing data for reanalysis for secondary review by appointed experts. So this is mind-blowing, you know.
Yeah. So
Different
just again,
applications.
maybe I got the wrong, so you're talking about genetic information about pathogens.
In a court of law, yeah.
Yeah. So as opposed to genetic information about human beings that those pathogens may have infected. Is that
Correct,
right?
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still human pathogens. We're obliged to remove human DNA from sequence file if this human DNA pieces are still present because it's a human sample. But it's certainly nothing to do with human identity. It's more to do with transmission of disease and injuries occurring as a result of the disease. And moral rights of individuals to consent to this data.
But just to be clear, I'm not sort of very au fait with. So it's the idea that when you identify, you're actually you're doing two things effectively in relation to, in a compensation case. In relation, they will this person A is arguing that, let's say, for argument's sake, they were given HIV by person B or something, right?
Yeah.
And then, but in order to determine whether that's the case, we need to know that there's a pathogen, namely HIV. That's one thing. But we also need to know that it was given to to person B, in other words, which is where the identification of person B comes in. Is that right? I mean, in order to identify person B, we have recourse to some genetic information about person B. Is that roughly where we're at? Yeah. Okay. Well, I haven't really thought about it. It's an interesting issue. I mean, one thing that immediately strikes me is I guess if it was a criminal case, so supposing HIV, the claim is that you have deliberately infected someone with HIV, in other words, you put them in a life-threatening situation, then it seems to me you would have to, that would have to be made available under, according to more or less the same set of principles as I've been discussing in relation to these other issues. If it's a less important, I don't know, some of these cases, you infected me with, you gave me food poisoning. I don't know. Are they all very at the sort of serious end, or the compensation?
People die as a result of poisoning.
Yeah.
And some companies that provided this fresh food.
Yeah, well, I mean, the only thing I can say, I guess, okay, so I take it that even if you can own, I mean, without getting into the details, it'd be one thing to have a gene patent in relation to a pathogen. I think that's a different set of, that's a different discussion and a different set of concerns from having a gene patent in relation to a human being, right? So in relation to the genetic information that pertains to the human being in terms of identifying and so on, presumably that can just be made available for the purposes of the trial or whatever it is, and then destroyed. So there's no sort of issue there of intellectual property ownership of as it were, the individual genetic information about Freddie or whatever, right? So I think that's the way I'd kind of approach that. It's interesting. I haven't really given it a lot of thought, but that's interesting. Yeah.
Johnny, and then Don.
Great, thanks, Dennis. So I was interested in some of the things you were saying about the model of consent here. So if I understood you correctly, if you buy the story that there's a joint moral right to some of this genetic data, which seems plausible, then that might create a problem because we might need the consent of all members to that joint right. And I wonder if we have to try that story. It seems there can be some joint rights where we don't require the consent of both or all parties to authorize waiving it. So one example might be a joint bank account, right? So if I have a joint bank account with my spouse, presumably we both have a right to that money, but we don't need the consent of both of us for every transaction. I can choose to use the money in some ways and she can use the money in some ways.
Yeah,
So you could have, given the public interest in this data, you know, why not have a weaker approach consent and perhaps this sort of conjunctive approach, if you want to call it?
yeah, okay, so, sure, I mean, I wanted to get the concept of a joint right on the table, but yeah, then there's questions about what is that, so there's a bunch of questions about, we've got a right to this, but other people haven't, right? So there's that kind of issue, and say, oh, well, the law enforcement people don't, and this, you know, okay. And then there's a set of sort of intro questions about, well, if it's a joint right, how's that structured? Does that mean I have to agree to everything, or is that already part of, if I've got a right to it, does that just mean that you've got a right to it interdependently with me having a right to it, but the content of the right is pretty unrestricted? I mean, I don't have to get any permission from you, actually. But with respect to the content of that right, it's just that I have the right conditionally on you having the right, and you can't, you know, or is it that there's a certain amount of content? This comes up with, it partly determines, it partly turns, I think, on what the content of the right is. Because if it's something, if you can get your money, it's something quite possible for you to do. Like you can consume something, and I don't need to be around to help you consume. If it's something else, which you can't actually do on your own, it may be that, well, no, actually you can't. You've got to need my consent because you. And then the question is, well, how do we want to? I mean, another issue which comes up with the genetic stuff is going to be, well, actually, it's a piece of intellectual property. And so we're going to have to both agree to it because otherwise you're going to do a whole lot of things. Like once it's out there, I can't have any control. So you've effectively undermined my right to determine whether or not my genetic data is whatever. So if it's that kind of content, then sorry, you're going to have to get my agreement because once it's out there, I don't have any control over it. You know, you've effectively seen to it that I can't exercise my right. So I agree with you. It very much depends. There's different, and there's also a bunch of questions about the basis for the joint right. So I think there's going to be some joint rights which are simply purely dependent on properties you have as a human being, let's say. And maybe the genetic one is one of them, but there's also going to be a bunch of other joint rights which are dependent on properties like so let's take an example of which people may not agree with this example. I'll throw it at you anyway. So let's assume that Australians, as they seem to think, have a joint right to exclude anyone from Australia. Famously, the American actor with a dog, what was his name? Johnny Depp, yeah. So you've got it. It's not that I've got a right to exclude anyone I like, or you've got a right to. It's that we have to jointly decide to exclude a person, possibly via the government, you know, or a category of persons. Okay. And you say, okay, that's great, we've got a joint right. So what's the basis of this joint right? So presumably it's something to do with, well, you know, we're all Australians and we're citizens according to this, that, and the other, and we've got an institutional arrangement, and the thing that we've got a joint right to exclude from is a sovereign territory, and blah 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 blah. So there'd be a long story, which would include a whole lot of institutional stuff as well as natural stuff. And the other thing is, the final thing is, you might decide, say with an intellectual property regime, you might say, okay, well that's fine. You know, I take your point. genetic information is pretty important to you. You can hang on to it. You've got a right to, but look, there's something far more important, which is the well-being of the human race. And the only way to get all these new medicines that are going to save us all from pandemics and what have you, is to have an intellectual property regime that grants patents to people in relation to genetic material. And so, well, hang on, I've what's going on here? I've got my right to, and say, well, you do have, actually. I mean, I'm granting you that. That's fine. But you know, we've just got this emergency for these pandemics, and we're just going to have to give all these big companies patents so they can go ahead and grab your intellectual. Yes, you know, you do own it, but we've overridden your right. And so with intellectual property regimes, you often hear that kind of argument. I mean, it's not actually clear as to what extent the argument is really, I'm a big company, I want to make lots of money, and to what extent it's actually because I think that sort of argument really can only ultimately work if it's a collective good of very considerable moral weight, you know. But it is a possible argument. I mean, so the fact that I'm suggesting that you may have these moral rights to this genetic information doesn't mean that's not the end of the story, I suppose. Yeah.
I wasn't pushing that angle, I was just asking.
Yeah.
John?
And I now have more questions, so I'll put one of them in the queue for subsequently. And so the first thing I was going to point out is there's a difference between police databases and public or health databases in the type of access. So police database, police can presumably search to see if a sample matches anybody in the database.
Yeah.
But they can't do that with the health databases or the 23andMe. They can't say, I want to know if anybody in 23andMe matches this sample.
No.
They have to say, with a warrant, and indeed the 23andMe website says that they will only respond to legal court orders warrants. And those warrants all have to relate to an individual. They can't be release all your data in 23andMe.
Sure.
They're going to have to be release the data of this individual who we have reason to believe you have a sample. So that's the first point about, which I think dilutes some of the concerns about these big data.
Yeah. So it wasn't the case originally in the US, I think, but now it is the case in the UK. Yeah, that does make a considerable difference. Yeah.
But then the main one I think I wanted to point out was the analogy between DNA and fingerprints.
Okay.
So we think that and there are the two reasons for thinking this is an interesting analogy. One is obviously we talk about DNA fingerprints all the time. Second is this is unique in identifying information, but we're very familiar with the idea that your fingerprints might identify you as being a criminal suspect, and we're also familiar with the right that the police, the idea that police have the right to request you to give a fingerprint.
Yeah.
But that's constrained. So they can only require you to give a fingerprint if they suspect you of a specific offence, or if they think you're not the person who you say you are. They can't require you to give a fingerprint if they think you're a relative of somebody who might have been a criminal offence. So I think there are interesting kind of questions about whether the police can.
But you can't, just to be clear, if the police, the fingerprint's more or less unique, apparently, some of them, but it doesn't have the same implication in terms, there's not a sort of family of fingerprints. You can't infer anything about someone else on the basis.
You might be more restrictive. You might be more restrictive of genes than fingerprints, but it seems unlikely that you would be less restrictive of access to DNA information than fingerprints. So if, for example, the police can't request my fingerprint because they think I'm a relative of somebody, I mean, there wouldn't be a point anyway.
Yeah, there wouldn't be any point, is what I'm saying.
But they wouldn't get a warrant on the grounds that I am merely connected to
Connected to, so in some other way, you mean?
So they can only get a warrant if they think I'm a suspect. So this is the reason for calling attention to this is the idea that police could require databases to provide information in relation to relatives. That seems to depart from our normal idea that police can only access identifying information, in this case fingerprint, of somebody who is a suspect.
Yeah, so that's right. So, but that was the kind of my point, but that was not what was going on. I mean, so that's why I think it's a slightly broader principle that I'm suggesting, but it's one that I think they need to comply with. But and in the UK, but originally they weren't. But my point was, sorry, just to get it quite clear what the principle was. So this is what I think the principle should be. I think you're talking about on page 10. The state has no right to seek evidence of wrongdoing on the part of a particular citizen or to engage in selective monitoring of that citizen if the actions of the citizen in question are not otherwise reasonably raised suspicion of unlawful behaviour, and if the citizen has not had a pattern of unlawful past behaviour that justifies monitoring in the case of monitoring. So I think that's a pretty important principle, and that doesn't mean
Yeah, so I think that the kind of short version is,
right.
I don't think police ought to be able to access somebody's DNA with merely a relative.
Yeah,
Um,
that's.
I
I agree with you. And I think that's the reason.
If they think that they're a suspect and they find out actually they're not a suspect, but they're a relative, that might be different, but.
Yes, so absolutely. So that is, in a nutshell, is one of the things I'm arguing, and that's the principle I think that they're infringing by doing that.
The other interesting analogy with fingerprints is, you can't refuse if you're suspected, to give a fingerprint, but you might be able to refuse to give a blood sample.
Right.
And maybe that's because it's more invasive. And one of the interesting scientific wrinkles is that police can now obtain DNA from a fingerprint.
Right.
So, if that's the case, like from a fresh fingerprint, at least, if that's the case, then the question about your ability to withhold your DNA, if they can obtain it from your fingerprint, then becomes kind of interesting.
No, that's interesting. I didn't know that about the fingerprints. But yeah, I think you're right about. I think the reason is that the DNA is far more sort of significant than the fingerprint. But of course, if it turns out that you get the DNA from the fingerprint, which I didn't realize, then I mean that becomes a problem. So
they don't need permission to take your blood
They don't need permission
if you're arrested.
if you're arrested. But do they need a warrant? A warrant or?
If you're arrested, I mean, there are 5 powers of arrest. If you're arrested under any one of these 5 powers, they can take your blood.
in the UK.
Sorry, someone, do you mind if someone?
Yeah, just adding on to that, so we're talking about getting DNA from the databases, but potentially the police get useful information without actually getting the DNA. So for example, we have a DNA profile, hypothetically.
You have a what?
So hypothetically, the police could have the DNA profile of a suspect. They get from 23andMe or Ancestry.com the name of a person who has some family overlap with that person's DNA, but without actually getting the DNA itself. Does that make a difference to your analysis? So all they're told is, well, look, this person, it looks like he or she could be related to Bob or Sally Smith. And you don't actually get the profile of Bob or Sally Smith.
Well, what would be so the first thing is, what would be
Massive utility.
Sorry?
Potentially it would have massive utility if you knew that there was some.
So hang on, I'm a bit so there's a crime,
Right.
and at the crime scene there's some blood,
Mhm.
and they can't identify the person at the crime scene on the basis of their database. Right, the DNA profile is not in their database.
Mhm.
Right, okay. So they're trying to pursue this individual. So they go to, so they go to the ancestry and say, and request what?
Request the names and dates of birth of people who have a familial relationship with the person. who-
Oh, they already know.
Without getting the DNA.
Okay, so that, okay, so the whole point of the forensic genealogy is that you construct the family relationships on the basis of the, anyway, okay. So if they already had, so they've already got the, that's a bit, so they got they got DNA of someone.
Mhm.
So
So for-
how do they know how do they know the relatives of the someone who's left their DNA? If they don't, if other than, they need, how do they know those individuals, given that so they can work out the names of a bunch of people who are related to the person who's the suspect?
So for example, I
Okay.
mean, I'm on, I think, my heritage doc. I supply them with my DNA sample and then my heritage or my ancestry, whatever it is, give me a list of all these people that I have some sort of.
Yeah, sure, but how do the police get to know what names to ask the ancestry people about? All they've got
They could
is
give the profile, and then they could.
the DNA profile. Yeah, okay, so, sure, okay, so they give right, so there has to be some use of that profile by ancestry. Right, I mean,
Yeah, so they're using.
Yeah, sure.
Ancestry will be using the offender's profile to identify relatives of the
Yeah,
offender,
sure.
but would not be disclosing,
well,
but would not be disclosing any DNA of anyone to the police. They would just be saying, hey, yep, it looks like.
okay, so they're getting at, so the DNA, okay, so
I'm just wondering whether this makes a difference if the police aren't being.
I didn't understand.
Your
So,
analysis.
okay, so what actually happened is the police hand the DNA profile to ancestry.com.
Mhm.
So here's a DNA profile of a suspect. I want you to trawl through all your, in the same way that we've just gone through our national database
Yeah.
and we can't find a match.
Mhm.
So what we want you to do is trawl through your database and either find a match or find someone who is connected to this. Yeah, that would be great. I'm sure the police would be they'd be pretty happy with that. But I mean, I think that really would be, I mean, that would be, well, I think that is unlawful, actually, clearly, I think, in most jurisdictions. I mean, you can't get ancestry.com to just sort of open up their whole entire database of profiles and so on, so the police can trawl through it. But yeah, I agree with you, it'd be pretty helpful.
I'm just making the
Yeah.
point that given
Yeah.
that with the way the discussion had been
Yeah.
going, we've been talking about getting a profile from someone. I'm just saying it's possible that there could be scenarios where it's useful to the police, even
Oh,
though the police are
absolutely.
not given anyone's profile.
That would be incredibly useful to the police, but yeah, I mean, yeah. Sure, it'd be useful, but in China, that's what they do. Just-
Just a quick point, just something for you to consider, which is,
Yeah.
I don't think it was mentioned, which is twins.
Yeah,
If you're a twin and you give your DNA, your
Yeah.
twin, they also have their exact same DNA.
yeah. So that's a clear case of a joint right. Because a lot of the other ones are, yeah.
I have
How much does, how the DNA was originally consented and obtained come into play? Because some of these companies, they have vastly varying ways that they do
Yeah.
consent. Some will sort of offer zero counselling to people. It's purely just buy the product, we'll give you a bit of information on the website.
Yeah.
Some will give counselling only after
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
done something, some will do before and after. And if you actually look at the websites, I mean, it's proper marketing, yeah.
Yeah.
People looking
Yeah.
very happy about, we put our sort of DNA into this and, we found out some sort of information. So it's just somebody who's, perhaps not fully informed or fully.
I think that's a big
consented.
issue. It's a big issue, yeah. What counts as being fully informed, particularly it's slightly tangential to my concern, but yeah, I mean, absolutely, there's a whole raft of issues there about, full, consent. Well, hang on, was it fully informed consent? That they had when to get that company got hold of the DNA, absolutely. It's an interesting, I think, an important issue. It's not, I don't think it, well, maybe, I'm not quite sure if it makes a difference.
I was wondering if there's a company that, did do the well-informed consent and did say, that, we will give up your DNA profile to MI5 if they request it.
Yeah.
Do the police have, perhaps a sort of a greater right to that than the sort of a rather dodgy company that didn't go through those?
Yeah, well, I suppose if you look at it if we're looking at it from the point of view of the rights of the person who's given their DNA to the private company, then, okay, so their rights are being sort of doubly violated, if you like, because in the first instance, let's say they weren't, when they consented, they weren't fully informed, didn't know what they were really doing. So that's a problem. And then, and if they had been, let's say the DNA wouldn't have been available to the police in the first place. Okay, so and then it gets, let's say, accessed by the police without, not in accordance with after moral principles and restrictions and so on that I might think should be in place. So they've been doubly exploited. They've been exploited commercially and then, as it were, by the criminal justice system, maybe. I don't know how much difference it's going to make to what I'm saying about police. I mean, well, I suppose it makes some difference. Supposing it makes this difference, I suppose. So supposing we've worked out the principles under which the police can get under warrant a DNA profile, and everything's in order, and off they go, the sort of Rolls Royce of ethical guidelines be complied with, blah blah blah. However, in this particular case, that person's DNA should never have been in the DNA database because they didn't actually consent to it, right? Well, maybe I don't know, under some that's, and so you might argue, well, the police should never have got it. There are conditions under which I mean, sometimes when the police, I guess the analogy is, so sometimes when the police go ahead and there's a trial and they convict this murderer and so on, and someone says, hang on, back when you collected that evidence, you violated this, that, and the other legal requirement. And some say, yep, hang him. And sometimes they say, okay, no, you're allowed to go free. So I think it can go, I'm not sure that it could have an impact, yeah. It could. Yeah.
Roger?
Yeah, I had a question about the value of biological identity. So if, imagine some utilitarian government is elected and it says to me,
is it a competent one?
Yeah, we've done, yeah, very competent. And they say we've done all the sums and so we're going to remove all your organs and divide them up, and it will increase
an individual or
me.
Oh, you.
I can imagine I might be tempted to say, hang on, I've got a right to these organs, you can't take them away.
Yeah.
And I think
are you going to
people
die
find
as a consequence?
Yeah, I'd die.
Yeah.
So obviously I'm going to lose something, right? But that seems to me a different sort of case than the case where the government says we want to know your biological identity.
Yeah.
It's not clear to me why I lose anything through their taking that.
They take it, yeah, sure, I mean, there are more and less serious cases.
Is the worry that they will, is the worry that they'll misuse it, or is it like, is it meant to be harming me that they actually know?
Well, no, okay, I mean, well, the argument is that you've got. So it's the informational content that's critical, so, unlike taking your organs and so on, you're not gonna die, that's the good news. So the question is, it's, if you like, it's, well, I'm trying to resist the idea that it's property, but it's kind of like intellectual property, right? So it's a bit more like, if you, analogous at any rate, to, Roger writes, you know, a very profound treatise, how to, these are utilitarian government, right? Okay, so how to solve the traffic problem in London, right? And but you own it, right? It's your intellectual property, and the government says no, we're not negotiating with you. We're not going to give you anything. We don't regard your intellectual property rights in relation to. You've done all this work. It's taken me 10 years to figure out how to solve the London's traffic problem, but you know, we're taking it. Okay. So you say, well, and then you say, oh well, they've stolen, you know, life's work and this, that, and the other, but I'm still alive. Well, okay. So then that, so I think the first question is, well, yeah, I guess it's not as bad as some other things like they're killing you. But so the question is, what is it like? It's a bit like stealing your intellectual property that is part of you. I mean, okay, that's the first, and then the question is, but I don't want to say it's intellectual property. I think there's an analogy there. And then the question is, well, what does that actually mean for you? Well, it could mean that someone makes a whole lot of money that you otherwise could have made, I guess. Say with patent, you know, if you've got a patent system, you might say, well, hang on, how come I own it, as it were, in that sense. So why are you taking it and then making all this money? I want. Or it could mean something, well, you know, what are you doing with it? I mean, if it was, I've got a genetic disease and you're gonna, now that you're gonna tell me I've got it and how to, or some mutant, whatever, and now you're going to save my life, well, fine, you know. So it seems to me, if that was what was going on, so a lot of it does depend on consequences, but I guess it still seems to me that the starting point is a bit like a little bit like the intellectual property thing. It's not going to necessarily kill you, but you've got, as it were, rights to control it, which can be overridden under certain circumstances. And I think the other thing is that if they are going to be, ideally it gets your consent, and it's presumably going to get your consent if it's going to do you some good, or if you're part of a group in the family case that you can do some good. But yeah, I don't think it's as bad as your first.
Were you saying you're done with your?
No, I was just, I had a follow-up on exactly this point too. I was just going to say it, but I think you acknowledge, James, that intellectual property both works and doesn't work in relation to these. So it works in the case of a company that's done intellectual effort and identified a gene that they're using to develop a drug. So they have a claim that they've got some intellectual property.
Right.
What doesn't make any sense is for me to claim that I have intellectual property in my gene.
Right.
So I might claim that it's property because it's mine, but they have claimed that they've got intellectual property. And then you have this conflict, I think, between two different types of ownership or property.
Right. Yeah, so, okay, so I think there's three, and I think there's probably three things going. So there's, it's part of me, and that's not really property but, you know, I've got, nevertheless, by virtue of it being part of me, and I'm a valuable entity, I'm assuming, I've got rights I've got rights, and some of those rights are to control this information about me. Okay, so that, now, so with the intellectual property, then there's an interesting question, I guess, around, which actually I was going to talk about before, because David Cupsall's got a lot, I don't know if you've read his stuff about this, but I think it's kind of interesting. So he's saying, well, but there's a whole lot of these people that want to patent genes, and they discovered something, right? We don't normally give patents to people who discover things. I mean, we give patents because if they design on the basis of the information, some, you know, new drug or whatever, or, you know, the cure for cancer or something, fine, you know, but the mere fact that they discover a gene and even a structure of genes and so on and so forth, that's science, man. That's discovery. That's not, we don't get to pay for that. Can't make any money out of that. So you shouldn't be allowed to, actually. I mean, and not only have you got to make something new, to create something, invent something, it's got to be genuinely new, and it's got to be useful, is I think one of the other criteria legally in most jurisdictions anyway, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of issues around that as well, that would come into play. Anyway, but yeah.
I have a question, maybe the final question, is we're almost running out of time, but if someone has something, I can always ask James later. So there was this case in the Netherlands a few years ago, a 20-year-old, 20-year unsolved mystery, where I think it was 2017. They asked law enforcement asked all the men in this region, 20,000 plus men, to volunteer some DNA so that they can find out who did it.
Yeah.
And as far as I understand, you know, they made it very clear that anyone volunteering, how they'd use their DNA that would be destroyed after, that wouldn't be used in other cases. Nonetheless, I mean, I don't know whether this is an artifact of media reporting or whether this is genuine, but a lot of men were sort of complaining that there's a kind of a coercive element of just by being asked, you raise this question, well, if I don't want to, you know, well, why aren't you volunteering? Like, maybe you are, so there's a kind of a lose-lose just by being asked almost, and I wonder how you thought about these scenarios. Well, so again, completely voluntary.
Well, I mean, the thing is that obviously, particularly in the forensic genealogy, I mean, if people understand what's going on, they know that they're closely related to the axe murder or whatever, you know. Whereas it sounds from what you're saying about your case, it's more we're going to sort of do a kind of very widespread, and with a view, they're not doing forensic genealogy, they're just knock out, there's 17,000 people in this town, and we know one who killed this person, so we're just going to do the DNA of everyone, you know, and the person who's left is going to be the guy. And you go, okay. But so I don't know. So so it might make a difference in terms of how you would think about this if it's just a random collection of strangers, and one of you, and you know you didn't do it, and someone else did it, and whatever, you know, and the 17,000, you think, well, I don't know how coercive that would. I mean,
yeah, I mean, I don't know if coercion is the right concept, but there's a kind of social pressure that sort of people don't like. But
yeah. Well, so okay, so I guess one thing there is, and this is a good case of, I think, collective responsibility, right? So there's 17,000 people, and so we all know that if let's say at least a very large percentage don't subject themselves to testing, that this is not going to go anywhere, right? So I, at the same time, I know that my contribution in and of itself is not going to make much difference. I mean, I'm assuming for the moment I'm in this. But So then it seems to me there's a kind of collective, I mean, whatever people feel about this, that, and the other, I think what they should feel, if it's a serious offence and so on, they should feel a kind of, they should feel there's a collective responsibility to come to the party and that in and of itself will probably, I think that's the best way, I think that's a good way to frame it. And if that's the case, then actually they should feel a bit of pressure because moral pressure, because actually they should make their contribution because, and not only should each person make their contribution, they're doing so in the context that it's pointless to make a contribution if others don't make theirs. I mean, the chances being remote. And so I think it is joint responsibility, as I would frame it. And in that context, I don't think there's anything wrong with people saying, by the way, have you given you know, because we really want to get this guy and what, I don't really feel, well, I think you should actually. So I think I'd sort of jump the other direction and say, well, I think there is a joint responsibility to contribute. It's pretty trivial. I'm assuming it's a fairly remote. So there's a joint responsibility and has some stringency because it's a very small cost to you, right? And the outcome is actually quite morally significant. You know, let's say you're going to take out the serial murderer, right? I mean, and so I think there is a moral responsibility which is joint. And B, I think I'd go further and say, well, actually, I think you're entitled to put some moral pressure on other people to do their bit if they're, yeah.
Thank you. It's right there. Thank you very much.